5 years ago, BuzzFeed accused me of being, and I quote their headline here, the king of bullshit news, in an article that was almost 7,000 words long. The person who exposed the fact that I was running a fake news factory on an industrial scale was Mr. Craig Silverman, described by his boss, the Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist Heidi Blake, as possibly the world's foremost expert on fake news. He'd developed a program called Emergent to expose fake news, long before fake news was even on the agenda. So what did it do? It involved uploading news to his program in order to get a truthiness rating. Truthiness ratings come in 3 different categories according to BuzzFeed: true, false, and basically not sure. Like, for example, a claim that IBM will cut more than 110,000 jobs this week. The end of the week came and went, and 3 months later, Emergent still didn't know whether it was anything other than not sure. Another story about a man who claimed he saw Bigfoot was given a truthiness rating of false because, hey, Bigfoot is a mythical creature. In fact, it probably should have been true because the story was not about whether Bigfoot exists, but rather about the fact that he claimed to have seen it. But I digress, because what I want to look at is how did they get all those false truthiness ratings that destroyed my reputation? Wait for it. They guessed. Yeah, you heard it right. BuzzFeed reporters spent all day on the web looking for URLs that mentioned me and my agency. If the story they found was one they felt was false, like a story on Snopes saying that sushi can be bad for your health, they added it to Emergent and gave it a false truthiness rating. When they weren't sure, the truthiness rating moved to undecided. And when it was something good and positive, like my award-winning journalism, my documentaries, my books, my charity work, or the fact that I help old ladies across the street, you guessed it, they ignored it. After all, much better to say that almost every story added to Emergent was either false or not proven than to have to admit many of them were true. We asked Craig Silverman about some of the stories that he looked at and later decided not to include in Emergent.
Is this the list of the 41 stories?
It appears to be, yes.
Now, for starters, are any of the stories that you collected in December of 2014 through Google Alert, or whatever the correct name is, included in this list?
I'm not sure.
Shall we compare it?
Sure.
All right, I'd ask you to take a look. So, let's take a look, shall we? Is the story about the one-legged man in this list?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Is the story about sick mom sedated after trying to eat baby in this list?
No.
Is the story boy 12 killed by car thief in this list?
No.
Is the story Moment Football thugs smash up KFC restaurant in this list? No. Is the story life coach surprised to find her rear in the spotlight? No. Is the story elite Mexican anti-kidnap squad in this list? No. Is the story miracle cure for disabled beggar in the list? No. Is the story kid left in coma after beaten by teacher for talking in the list? No. Is the story police hunt on the run English speaker with 10 Asian kids in the list? No. Is the story Romanian army dumps hero bomb disposal dog in the list? No. Is the story world's first and only bike elevator in the list? No. Is the story bloody protest ends with naked people in a heap in the list? No. Is the story perv arrested for juice carton spy cam in toilets in the list? No. Is the story lone kindergarten survives destruction of housing complex in the list? No. Is the story virgin on the wreck ridiculous as Miss Bum Bum looks for Mr. Right in the list? No. Is the story British family fights for justice in Turkey in the list? No. Is the story man venting frustration over debt survives 16-floor drop in the list? No. And finally, is the story gentleman tries to buy tortoise, a tortoise bites first in the list? No.
Don't you think, to be fair to CNN about the percentage of its stories that contain falsities or alleged falsities and mistakes, you should have included all the ones you actually looked at?
I don't recall looking at those stories or not. I'm not sure to what extent I did.
Okay.
So as you can see, there are many things that didn't actually make it into the king of bullshit news. I must apologise at this point for swearing all the time. Bullshit's not really a word I feel comfortable with, despite apparently being the king of it. I think after years of reading through BuzzFeed paperwork, some of their influence has rubbed off, and they like swearing a lot. It's common in their editorial meetings where they discuss the latest status of my agency and Emergent. If I was the lead editor on a major story like this, lasting months and involving, according to the documents I've seen, over 80 people at one stage or another, I'd say something like, "Have we spoken to the source to check it's all true?" That sentence, though, or anything like it, never appeared in BuzzFeed's discussions. So what did they discuss if all they were doing was cut and paste journalism? This, for example, is a typical BuzzFeed editorial meeting, as confirmed by documents handed over during disclosure. Fucking CEN. I hate CEN. CEN bollocks. God, I hate CEN. And the poor chap who arrived late and waded in saying, "Just to add another voice to the fuck CEN consensus." At least they had Emergent for their journalism, although the head of their investigations unit, Heidi Blake, admitted she didn't really understand it.
As part of your involvement in the story, did you become familiar with a software product called Emergent?
I don't recall.
You don't recall that Mr. Silverman had created software supposedly to be able to debunk stories?
I recall that Craig was using some sort of digital wizkiddery to debunk stories. I didn't know what it was called.
You don't know what it was called or what it did or how it did it?
No.
And do you know whether, as part of Mr. Silverman's process, there is something called truthiness evaluation?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Have you ever heard any of the people that you just mentioned use the word truthiness about a story?
I don't believe so.
But how did this digital whiz-kiddery end up being used as part of the BuzzFeed investigation at all? Quite simple. Silverman wanted to sell it. It was something he'd knocked up in just 3 months. He then wanted the BuzzFeed team to use it to show what it could do. Unfortunately for them, it had obviously never been properly tested and was ditched halfway through because of problems, like the fact there was no login button. Instead, it was replaced by an Excel document, which just doesn't have quite the same glamour factor and might explain why Excel didn't get an honorary mention in the final piece, but Emergent did. Stuffing it full of CEN stories to prove the case against the king of bullshit news would have been a good way to impress his new boss, Ben Smith, who admitted he was offered the chance to buy it. Both seem to have no problem at all with the fact that the BuzzFeed editorial code advises honesty in declaring an interest in any items a reporter writes about. Under the section Conflict of Interest and Disclosure, it states, if you're asking yourself, is this a conflict of interest? It likely is. It goes on, writers and editors should disclose if they have a financial or personal stake. Have you disclosed this? Reporters should not have a financial stake in a company in the industry they cover. Check with your editor about whether disclosure is enough, or whether the story should be reassigned. He never did. Instead, he took a job as head of BuzzFeed Canada and has been working there ever since. In his book on how to expose fake news, Silverman agrees with me that you need to go to the source before republishing unverified claims from the internet. Yet he was so busy trying to sell Emergent that he just decided to go with the flow and provide lots of false truthiness ratings for the final version. You may be interested to know that the term truthiness rating was actually coined in 2005 by the comedian Stephen Colbert, and it worked fine as a joke, but arguably it has no place in an investigations team who, it seems, were aware of the seriousness of what they were doing. Actually, that's the wrong screen. Sorry. Here it is again, this time from Alan White. It looks like we'll basically show that several of our competitors have been publishing huge lies on a close to industrial scale. It'll really piss a few publishers off and would also probably be the end of this guy's business. It's therefore vital we're absolutely accurate about every detail. People will be keen to shoot it down. Not only was Emergent quite literally a joke, but it also had another flaw, because like the rest of the BuzzFeed team, it only spoke English, and all of the stories they looked at were in everything but English, including Chinese, Russian and Spanish. Leider kannte sie keine andere Sprache, sonst hatte sie eine bessere Truthiness-Bewertung gehabt. Instead, Emergent took time away from what they should have been doing, which is investigating the allegations they were later to publish. Here's a sample from the documents on what Silverman's unlucky colleagues were dealing with Emergent. Go to edit.emergent.info. Sign in with the Gmail account you sent me, brackets, Emergent only works with Gmail accounts, close brackets. Click the login with your Google account link. Enter a slug like this that describes the story. This will be the URL. It continues with more digital whiz-kiddery until they get to the complicated bit about guessing. If you know if it's true or false, choose the appropriate radio button in the upper right and then put in the info about why you know it's true or false, and add in a debunking URL if you have one. Wait for it. This is the good bit. He then adds, I suspect in many cases the debunking URL will be the story on BuzzFeed. That can be added in later. So, BuzzFeed was quoting itself as proof that the story was false. And they say I ran a fake news factory? Not really a surprise that it was replaced with Excel, which, although it worked without a hitch, simply never had the glamour of Emergent. The Excel document didn't have a truthiness rating either, even though it worked the same way with what BuzzFeed now called a traffic light system. Red for fake, yellow for not sure, and green for let's ignore that one. Silverman was giving BuzzFeed too much credit. When he said they would use their own stories to prove an item was false, we found they also used some other sites like Snopes.
What is Snopes?
Snopes is a debunking website. It runs stories about other stories that its staff consider to be fake or questionable, or indeed not. It operates to a traffic light system similar to the one we were using.
So is it fair to say that you relied on Snopes for the idea that the sashimi story had been debunked?
We did.
And didn't do any further research into whether that was true or false?
We did not.
It was a subject revisited again later in the case.
Mr. White, earlier in your testimony you talked about, I think, Snopes having the same light system as BuzzFeed. Do I correctly remember that?
I don't know if that's the case now, but they did at the time, as I recall.
And what is a light system?
So a traffic light system of, I'm not sure quite how the colours correspond, but say, for example, red is debunked, amber is unclear, and green is true. We adopted something similar in our spreadsheet of stories that we were looking at.
I see. So the light system is not general at BuzzFeed, but was used on the preparation of the story?
Correct. That's just an informal thing that the three of us.
And in applying the light system to the stories you were looking at, was it simply a matter of subjective assessment of the story?
Yes, I think that would be a fair reading.
So the people that were using Emergent to brand me the king of bullshit news were making subjective estimates on whether the stories I wrote were true or not. Mr. White did not seem to think there was anything wrong with guessing whether the story was wrong or not, because Snopes was doing the same, and no doubt he hoped to be able to blame them if it all proved wrong. The fact that this meant no journalism was being done as everyone was guessing seemed not to matter.
Truthiness.
Based on a comedian's joke, I was branded the king of bullshit news. When Silverman was asked about the subjective evaluation, he tried to defend Emergent by saying, well, it could spot when changes were made to the story later, but this will only help if the original poster decides to change anything.
Now, is this a system that could by itself debunk a story?
No.
You still would need someone to go and check out the facts at some point, correct?
Correct.
Was there something connected with this project that Emergent called a truthiness rating?
Oh, yes, I believe our internal designation of how we were rating an article, I think we used the term truthiness rating.
So it was a way to rate the article that you were entering into the system to follow?
Yes.
He then admitted the term truthiness rating was inspired by Stephen Colbert, which meant that guy really owes me an apology.
How did you create a truthiness rating for any particular piece?
It involved looking at the content of the story itself and examining the claims that were being made about the core claim that we were interested in, and then determining what evidence it had to back that up.
So it was basically a subjective evaluation by the person entering the story.
It was an evaluation by the person entering the story using a methodology that we set out.
And what would be the significance of the truthiness rating in the operation of Emergent?
It was used by us in the research to determine, the data that we had.
Could you tell me what you mean by determine the data that we had?
Well, when we would go to analyze the data, we were able to look at stories that were unverified, stories that were true, stories that were false, and we were able to then compare that to things like our social interaction data that we had.
I confess I'm still not clear about how the truthiness rating worked.
He's not the only one. The reality is that Emergent was a complete waste of time, forced onto the unlucky UK team by Silverman, who was desperate to flog it off and saw no conflict of interest in doing so. In conclusion, all I can really say is, thanks very much, Stephen Colbert, who didn't return my call when I asked for a comment, probably because he Googled me and found I was the king of bullshit news.